Today is Friday. Jesus has been convicted of high blasphemy by the Jewish courts. He's claimed to be the Son of God, and this comes with the penalty of death. However, the Jewish courts operated under the authority of the Roman courts, and only the Roman officials had the authority, had the right to carry out an execution. So for this reason, the Jewish authorities have to bring Jesus to the Roman authority, Pontius Pilate, and request that Jesus be put to death. Pilate examines Jesus and is unable to come up with any good reason why he should die. So understandably so, he is deeply burdened by the idea of executing an innocent man. But at the same time, Pilate's jurisdiction is heavily populated by Jews. And so what makes it complicated is he also cares very deeply about the Jewish opinion, particularly the Jewish authorities, those who in charge. So Pilate is torn. He doesn't want to kill an innocent man, and he doesn't want to upset the chief priests who want him to kill this man. So ever the politician, Pilate comes up with a solution, and his solution is a man named Barabbas. Barabbas was a notoriously wicked Jewish murderer with a death sentence, and he would become Pilate's political loophole out of this tension. You see, during the Passover celebration, the Roman authorities always would release a Jewish prisoner as a way to, I guess you could say, appease the Jewish crowds and the Jewish citizens. So Pilate's plan was this. He will take the worst criminal he has, Barabbas, and then he would take this Jesus guy, and he would let the crowds decide who should go free. And in his mind, of course, they're going to choose Jesus over Barabbas. And then Pilate can come and say to the chief priests who want Jesus killed, say, look, I'm sorry, the crowds chose Jesus to be released, and I had to give them their prisoner as is custom. But then comes the shocking development that we read in Mark 15. Let me read that for us. Now at the feast Pilate used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowds came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd and had to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews? And they cried out again, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. So the crowds choose Barabbas. Pilate has no cards left to play, and he consents to a guiltless man's death. Today, Friday, will bring death to the innocent one and freedom to the wicked one. You know, imagine it from Barabbas' perspective. Surely, one would assume he'd been up all night wrestling with the reality of his death the next day. Probably, in prison, he had been counting down the months, then started counting down the weeks, then the days, then the hours, and now it's moments. The Roman soldiers opened the door to his cell. He's thinking, this is it. They're here to crucify me. They lead him out to what he expects will be Rome's notoriously brutal pre-crucifixion torture. Then they unchain him, and they say to him, you're free to go. This has to be a cruel joke. The soldiers were notorious for mocking their prisoners while they tortured him. But this is no cruel joke. They insist, you can go. Jesus of Nazareth is set to die in your stead. It's impossible for us to imagine what it would be like to come to the last hour of a death sentence and then just like that, be set free. But those who trust in Christ will experience it for themselves on an ultimate level. You see, there really is a God, and that God really is just. And there really is indeed a judgment day, a reckoning. And we will all give an account for every thought, every word, every deed. That is a reality that we all are facing, and it's coming for us. Unlike Barabbas, we don't know the day or hour of our reckoning, but make no mistake, it's coming. Day by day, hour by hour, moment by moment, that reckoning draws near. What will you do when it arrives? When you are laid bare before the judgment of the Almighty Judge? What will you do when it's time to give an account for everything you have thought, said, and done? I don't care how good you think you are. You have to admit that that is a terrifying thought. To be utterly exposed and then face judgment for everything that is uncovered. Listen, you can ignore this if you want. You can try to explain away God by science or philosophical reasoning. You can try to domesticate God into a God who is not righteous, is not just, would never judge. You can do whatever you feel like you need to do to make yourself feel better, but I still know you are deeply unsettled about this issue. And deep down, whether you perceive it or not, there is fear. And do you want to know when that fear will rise up and seize you? When it's time for you to find out. In those last moments of life, who knows? Perhaps it will be COVID-19 that brings you to that moment. Those last conscious thoughts when you are about to discover for yourself whether there is indeed divine judgment waiting for you on the other side. You will feel like Barabbas felt when his jail cell opened that day and he thought he was being led to his execution. Would you also like to feel what Barabbas felt when they loosed his chains and set him free? Because that's possible for you too. That can be yours as well. The same substitute is available to all of us. Jesus did it for Barabbas. He's willing to do it for you too. The Christian will cross over into death and be met with words so amazing that they will compel us into eternal worship. The judge will say, Jesus has died in your stead. You are free to go for all eternity. I pray your reckoning day will be like Barabbas's. I pray you trust in the innocent one who died on behalf of the shameful ones. If so, your day of death will become your day of freedom.